You think the scariest thing in the forest is a bear, a wolf, or a giant shadow in the trees. For him, it was all three, on the same day. Here's the truth almost no one knows. The creature millions believed to be the most dangerous was the only reason Jonas Whitaker, 56, survived a brutal wilderness accident in 1992. I've studied over 20 documented Bigfoot encounters in Montana, but Jonas's case is the only one with clear evidence of medical care from the creature itself. Stay with me, because you're about to learn exactly what the green resin it smeared on his wounds was, how it stopped infection almost instantly, and why it returned his leather journal before disappearing. Jonas told me, "I had a broken leg, a broken arm, blood soaking my shirt. The thing, over 7 feet tall, red-brown fur, dragged me to safety, brought water and berries, and never left my side for 2 nights. On the 3rd day, it walked away, with the saddest eyes I've ever seen." Jonas's journal has been opened only once, today. Miss this, and you may never hear the truth about the kindest monster in Montana's history. The air smelled like smoke and frost. Out beyond the pines, a slow wind whispered through the canyon, brushing golden leaves from their branches like a soft undoing. It was late September, and the Bitterroot Mountains were quietly dying. The trees hadn't turned fully yet. Some still clung to their summer greens. But the maples bled red down the slopes, and the birches had begun to pale. Every morning the fog rolled in early and didn't burn off until close to noon. The sky stayed the color of old steel. Cold clung to the earth like regret. Jonas Whitaker split wood with the same dull rhythm he always had. Axe, lift, swing. Wood split with a dry crack. Again, and again, and again. His hands were blistered, wrapped in old leather gloves. His breath curled in the air. The edge of his cabin roof sagged under moss, and the window panes shook whenever the wind hit just right. That morning, the silence was thick. Even the birds kept to themselves. He stacked the firewood in slow, methodical rows against the outer wall, pausing only once, to wipe sweat from his temple, to glance back toward the trees. The fog lay heavy between the trunks, layered like smoke, hiding things that probably weren't there. Probably. But Jonas looked anyway. His gaze lingered too long, as if waiting for something to move. The cabin creaked behind him, old and stubborn like his knees. He stepped inside. The floorboards moaned. The air was dry and filled with the faint scent of pine sap, dust, and something fainter. Maybe a woman's perfume, but only if you'd known her long enough to remember how she used to stand at the stove, humming something sad. The walls were lined with faded photographs. One frame, cracked at the corner, held the last picture he ever took of her. Marlene, in her Sunday dress, with that tired smile. Another photo sat beside it, this one of a young man, rough around the edges, hair too long, eyes too bright to last. His name was Caleb, Jonas's brother. A leather-bound notebook rested on the kitchen table, worn at the edges, its corners dog-eared and inked with years of quiet confession. He flipped it open, thumb grazing over the yellowed page. The handwriting was steady, but tired. Some mornings he didn't know why he was still here. Maybe because the mountains didn't ask questions. Maybe because dying slow felt like a kind of justice. He poured himself a tin cup of cold coffee left on the stove, stared out the window. Just fog, trees, silence, then a sound, low, like thunder stuck in the throat of the woods. It didn't belong. Not wind, not wolf. Jonas froze, fingers wrapped tight around the handle of the cup. The sound came again, distant, maybe a mile off, but too real to ignore. He set the cup down slowly, walked to the door, opened it. Nothing. Just mist moving through the pines like ghosts. He didn't call out. He didn't move toward the sound. He only stood there a while, until the cold finally seeped through his boots. Then he turned, went back inside, and shut the door. He sat at the table and opened the journal. Wrote without thinking. Ink scratched across the paper like breath drawn through teeth. Not everything in the forest is cruel, but man can be. His pen stopped moving. Outside, something rustled in the underbrush, quiet as doubt. That night, the dream came back. It always started with the saw, the whining, shrieking kind that ate into pine and didn't stop until it found bone. Caleb was ahead of him, up near the ridge, hauling the ropes, setting the lines. The clouds had been rolling in, heavy and dark. Jonas told him to wait, told him they'd come back tomorrow. But Caleb had laughed, said he could do it blindfolded, said he wanted to finish early. Then there was the fall. Always the fall. He woke up soaked in sweat, the wool blanket tangled around his legs, heart pounding like fists on a closed door. His lungs ached, his hands trembled. The smell of wet pine lingered on the air. Outside, the wind howled down the mountain pass like it was mourning something it could never name. That was the morning Jonas decided to leave the cabin. He didn't think about it long. He didn't leave a note. Just packed a small satchel, knife, flint, a few strips of jerky, water flask, the journal. He considered the rifle leaning against the back wall, but didn't take it. The weight of it felt wrong. Jonas had spent years trying to forget what a man looked like when he'd been shot. He wasn't about to take that memory back with him. Besides, he wasn't hunting anything. Not really. He stepped outside just after dawn. The mist was still thick, curling low along the ground like breath from some sleeping beast. The sky above was washed in gray and gold, the sun bleeding slowly over the ridge. Jonas moved into the trees without looking back. Behind him, the cabin disappeared like it had never been there. He followed the old game trail, overgrown and narrow. The leaves had begun to fall in earnest, bright red and yellow scattered like blood and gold coins across the path. The forest felt alive in that way it only does when it's watching you. Every twig that snapped beneath his boot echoed louder than it should have. Every gust of wind through the trees whispered secrets just out of reach. Hours passed. He crossed a shallow stream where the water ran clear and bitterly cold. The rocks were slick, and he moved slow, careful not to slip. On the other side, just past a patch of thistle and fern, he saw it. A footprint, deep, wide, the edges still wet. It was longer than his own foot by almost half again and sunk into the mud as though left by something impossibly heavy. Jonas crouched, ran his hand along the edge of it. The toe marks were clear. The heel sunk deep. Whatever left it hadn't been wearing boots. He didn't say a word, just stood, listened. The forest had gone still. Then, just faint, riding on the wind, there it was again. That strange, sharp scent. Not quite animal, not quite rot. Almost like sap, fresh cut and bitter. He didn't follow the tracks. Not yet. But something inside him shifted, like a needle turning toward a storm. The trees grew darker as he moved deeper. The path narrowed. The light thinned. And somewhere far off, something was watching. Jonas kept walking, because he knew the only way through the past was straight into it. The morning air tasted sharper than usual, cold enough to bite through the wool of his sweater, sharp enough to make his lungs sting with every breath. Jonas stood at the edge of the clearing, the same place he'd stared into the woods countless times before. But today, something had changed. Not the trees. They still stood silent and tall, cloaked in fog thick as sheep's wool. Not the sky. It remained heavy with cloud, dull gray and aching. No, the change was in him. And it had started with the dream. He didn't speak it aloud. Didn't need to. It clung to him like damp clothes. Caleb's voice echoing in the timberline, laughing, shouting, then gone. That empty sound after something breaks. That look in his brother's eyes the last time he saw him alive, still burned into Jonas's memory like it had been carved there. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the sound from the woods the day before. Maybe it was both. But something told him this was the time. The past had lived with him long enough. Now, he needed to walk through the place where it had died. He packed without hesitation, moved through the cabin with quiet certainty, like he'd rehearsed this moment before in the back of his mind. A knife, nothing fancy, just the old one with the stag handle, a coil of rope, a flask of water, 2 strips of dried venison, a folded piece of canvas, and the notebook. Always the notebook. He slid it into the canvas pouch, paused for a moment by the window, and looked toward the rifle leaning against the far wall. His hand hovered over it but didn't touch. Shooting had never brought anything back. Shooting was for fear, and Jonas didn't want to carry fear into those woods. He stepped outside. The fog was already lifting, chased away by a thin breeze that moved like a whisper between the trees. The colors of autumn flared along the ridges, reds bleeding into gold, gold fading to brown. Leaves spiraled through the air, soft and soundless, landing in clusters that blanketed the path ahead like rust-colored snow. Every footstep crunched faintly. The path he chose wasn't marked, just a faint line where the forest gave a little, and a man could slip through if he was careful. Hours passed like water through cupped hands. He walked alone, deeper and deeper into the silence. A jay called once, sharp and startling, then was gone. The woods grew darker the farther he went. The air thickened. The wind died. Somewhere behind him, the world of roads and walls and roofs fell away. He didn't look back, only forward. The trail narrowed, hemmed in by lichen-covered boulders and low branches that clawed at his sleeves. A squirrel dashed through the underbrush, and he startled, not from fear, but from forgetting the world could still move that fast. He crossed a stream. The water was like ice, clear to the stones beneath, dancing over moss-slick rocks and fallen leaves. He crouched, cupped water to his lips, and drank. It burned his throat, pure and unforgiving. As he stood again, he noticed something by the bank, half buried in mud, just at the edge of the sandbar. A footprint. It didn't look right. Too long, too wide. The toes spread out like a hand, the heel sunken deep like a sack of bricks had stepped there. No tread, no boot mark, just the shape of something living and enormous. He didn't touch it. He just stood there, heart heavy in his chest, watching the woods beyond. The wind shifted, and the scent came. Not rot, not musk, not anything he could put a name to. It reminded him of pine sap after the bark's been stripped, sharp, clean, with something almost metallic underneath. It stuck in the back of his throat. The trees ahead seemed darker now, like something waited just out of sight. Still, he kept walking. His footfalls softened as the earth grew damp again. A layer of wet leaves matted beneath his boots. He followed the shape of the land, through gullies and over low rises, guided more by instinct than direction. Occasionally he'd pause, not from tiredness, but to listen. The forest had a way of breathing. Sometimes it inhaled. Sometimes it held its breath. Now it was silent, waiting. By afternoon, the light began to shift. Long shadows stretched between the trunks. The warmth of the sun, what little there had been, faded behind gray clouds that rolled over the ridge. He passed through a grove of sugar maples, their leaves bright as fire, their branches arching above him like cathedral rafters. A single leaf drifted down and landed on his shoulder. He let it stay. Everywhere the sound of falling leaves, like rain that never quite landed. Then, just past the bend in the slope, a sound. Soft, dull. Not animal, not natural. Almost like breath. Heavy, controlled. Jonas crouched low behind a cluster of ferns. The sound came again. Faint footfalls, impossibly slow, waited. Something moved in the mist ahead. He couldn't see it, not yet. But he felt it. Not fear, not quite awe. Something deeper, like being near a truth that had never been spoken aloud. He waited. The sound faded. When he rose again, the air felt different. Charged. He didn't call out, didn't reach for the knife. Just kept walking, eyes wide, breath shallow, like someone stepping through the edge of a dream. Not long after, he reached a clearing, small, almost unnatural in its shape, as if something large had moved through recently, brushing trees aside. The ferns were flattened. The bark on a pine tree scraped high, far higher than any bear Jonas had ever seen. He turned in a slow circle. The forest stood still. The wind had stopped. And then, a single call from deep within the trees. Low, vibrating. Not human, not beast. A sound that didn't belong to any language, but carried the weight of knowing. It didn't come again. Jonas stood there long after the echoes faded. He didn't know what the sound meant, but he knew it had meant something. His hands trembled at his sides. The light had almost gone now. Shadows clung to the edges of the trees like ink spilled across the canvas of the forest. He needed to find shelter before dark truly fell. But still, he waited a moment more, heart hammering. Because for the first time in years, the silence inside him had cracked. Not broken, but cracked, enough to let something through. Something like a beginning. And somewhere, far behind him, the woods began to breathe again. The light was dying. Not fast, but slow, like a candle forgotten in a corner, flickering softer with each breath of wind. Jonas moved along the base of a slope, his legs stiff from hours of walking, the weight of silence building around him. The trail had thinned until it barely held shape beneath the tangle of roots and leaves. The trees pressed in tighter now, branches crowding overhead, casting everything below in a dim amber haze. Somewhere far above, the sun had begun to dip behind the ridge, dragging long shadows down the trunks like spilled ink. The air changed with it, cooler, damper, thick with the smell of soil and rot, and something that hinted at snow. His boots sank deeper into the moss with every step, and the deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to hold its breath. He stopped near a narrow run of water, barely more than a trickle, but the sound of it against stone felt almost too loud. Kneeling, he cupped a palm to the flow and brought it to his lips. It tasted like copper and root, clean but wild. As he drank, he heard it. A sound. A low, grating rattle that seemed to start somewhere behind his shoulder and build until it became something primal, something that didn't belong to wind or water. The forest answered in a shiver. The leaves trembled where there was no breeze. He turned slowly. At first there was nothing, just trunks, fog, dull amber light. But then the leaves shifted again. No, not the leaves, the trees themselves. Something moved between them, big, ground heavy. He heard another sound now, deeper, a thump, like something pushing off the earth with a body not meant to walk quiet. Then the roar. It cracked through the forest like a shotgun blast. Jonas flinched, not from the volume, but from the tone. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a threat. He barely had time to rise before he saw it. A grizzly, at least 8 feet tall, filthy, matted, and wet from creek water, muscles rippling beneath hide that shimmered with oil and dirt. Its teeth bared in a snarl, yellowed and chipped, breath steaming out in thick white bursts. It stared at him, not like prey, not like a passing threat, but like a challenge, a test, and Jonas knew the rules. No sudden moves, no eye contact too long, and never turn your back. He took a slow step back, then another. The bear didn't flinch. It grunted low and took a step forward, then another. Its weight crushed the underbrush flat, each paw fall loud enough to feel in the chest. Jonas turned and ran. The sound that followed was like thunder cracking through timber. The bear moved. Fast. Faster than anything that size should. Branches snapped. Earth shook. Jonas didn't look back. He ducked low under limbs, feet sliding over moss and stone, heart hammering like a war drum. He could hear it gaining, closer, closer, the ragged rasp of its breath growing louder than his own. He veered downslope, legs burning, boots slipping. The world narrowed to instinct and panic. Then his foot hit wet stone. The ground disappeared. He fell. There was no scream, just the rush of wind and the snap of brambles as he tumbled through the air. He landed hard. His side took the first impact, then his shoulder, then his skull. The world flashed white, then black, then nothing. He lay still, not dead, not yet, but close. The sound of the forest came back in pieces. Water, wind, a crow far off cackling at nothing. He didn't move, couldn't. Somewhere above, the grizzly roared again. But it sounded farther now, muffled by distance and trees, and maybe by the fact that he was lying at the bottom of a steep ravine, lucky to still be breathing. Pain came next. His ribs ached with every breath. His leg throbbed, twisted at a wrong angle. The side of his head felt wet. He didn't know how long he lay there. Minutes, maybe hours. The sky above turned darker, the fog thicker. The last of the light filtered down in pale strips through the leaves, and then something stepped into it. Big, red-brown. It didn't move like the bear. It didn't move like anything he'd ever seen. It stood still, broad shoulders hunched, long arms hanging at its sides, hair thick and shaggy. The shape of it wasn't animal. It wasn't right. It was too upright, too deliberate. A shape from a story he didn't believe in, couldn't believe in, not until now. The creature watched him. Didn't growl, didn't come closer, just stood there still as stone. Jonas blinked, thought maybe he'd died. But he felt the cold. He felt the pain. He tasted blood in his mouth. He was alive, and the thing was still watching him. Then it took a step forward. Not fast, not threatening, just enough to show it could. Its eyes caught the light, dark, reflective, like wet obsidian. And Jonas knew in that moment, without reason or proof, that this wasn't a beast, not in the way the bear had been. This thing, this being, knew what it was doing, and it knew what he was. It crouched, lowered itself beside him. The air shifted again, colder, but not cruel. He didn't speak, couldn't, but something in his chest loosened. Not fear, something else, something he didn't have a name for yet. The thing looked at him, then, without sound, turned and disappeared into the trees. The silence that followed felt bigger than before. He didn't know if he would survive the night, but something had found him, and something had decided to let him live. For now. The first thing he heard was water. Not rain, not a stream in the distance. This was closer, slower, the kind of drip that came from soaked leaves or melting frost, steady and patient, like time had slowed to a crawl. Then came the wind, sliding through the trees in long sighs, brushing against bark and bramble, as if the whole forest was murmuring something only it could understand. The sky above flickered in flashes of light and shadow, filtered through a canopy he couldn't yet recognize. For a moment, Jonas wasn't sure if he was alive or dreaming, but the cold in his bones told him he was still tethered to the world. Barely. He opened his eyes to gray light and blurred outlines. His head throbbed. The scent of crushed fern and wet moss filled his nose. Pain curled up from his side, sharp and biting, and his leg felt like it had been filled with gravel. He tried to move and instantly regretted it. A breath escaped his mouth that sounded more like a groan than a word. Then, a shape. It moved into focus slowly, like something rising from deep water. Tall, broad, covered in hair that shimmered red-brown under the broken light. Its eyes locked onto his, not wild, not predatory, calculating, curious, and in some impossible way, knowing. It crouched beside him, close enough that he could hear its breath, deep, slow, deliberate. One of its hands, massive and rough, reached out, not in violence, but in a strange, delicate sort of examination. The fingers, long and wide, hovered for a moment over the wound on his ribs, then touched gently. Jonas flinched, but the touch was strangely careful, not probing, not pressing, just a brush, as if the creature was trying to understand what had broken. The hand lifted to its nose. It sniffed once. Then again. A low sound came from its throat, not a growl, but something more like a hum, deep and resonant. It felt less like a warning and more like thought made audible. Jonas couldn't speak. His mouth was too dry, his jaw too tight, but his eyes followed the thing as it rose, turned, and disappeared into the trees without a sound. Seconds passed, then minutes. Then the creature came back. It carried something in one hand. Long strands of vine and branches that looked like they had been twisted into crude ropes. In its other hand was a bundle of green leaves, thick and damp with sap. Jonas watched, frozen. It sat beside him again and began working. First, it lifted his leg, cradling it with eerie gentleness. It wrapped the vines around two narrow pieces of wood, tying them tight on either side of the break. Then it turned to his side and gently packed the leaf bundle against the wound. The scent hit him immediately, pungent, almost sweet, like pine sap mixed with crushed mint. It stung like fire. His breath caught in his throat. The creature backed away a step, as if watching for his reaction. He stared into its eyes again, and for the first time, saw something that didn't belong in an animal. Recognition. Then, slowly, it reached into a pouch strapped to its waist, pulled out what looked like a hollowed piece of wood, filled with clear water. It set it down beside him, carefully, then rose, and vanished into the trees once more. Jonas lay still for hours. The pain pulsed in waves, but there was something else inside him now, something unexpected. A kind of quiet awe. He wasn't dead. He wasn't alone. And the thing that had found him, whatever it was, had chosen to help him. The clouds above shifted. A shaft of light broke through the trees. He saw it then, just beside his arm, half buried in moss. A single red maple leaf. Not just red, bright crimson, too clean to have fallen naturally. And stuck in the fibers of the leaf was a single strand of long reddish hair, coarser than human. He didn't touch it, didn't move, just stared at it, his chest rising and falling, slow and unsteady. That night came quickly. The forest darkened early, but Jonas didn't feel afraid. The fire never came. There were no roars, no snapping branches, only that quiet again, and in it, footsteps. Heavy, measured, circling, always close, sometimes closer. Once they stopped beside him for so long he thought maybe it had gone. Then he opened his eyes, and there it was, just standing, lit faintly by the moon, its outline haloed in silver, motionless. Its breath fogged the cold air like a signal. It didn't move, didn't speak, didn't vanish, just watched. And Jonas, for the first time in decades, didn't feel like a man waiting to be punished. He felt like someone worth watching over. The wind stirred the trees above. Leaves whispered to each other, and the night stretched on. The forest didn't speak much during the day, but at night, it watched. Jonas woke in fragments, like the sky peeling back layer by layer. The sun had not yet broken through, but the fog above him glowed soft gray, diffused through the treetops like light trapped behind frosted glass. His breath came shallow. Cold pressed into his bones. He could feel the dampness settling in. He blinked slowly, trying to piece together what had changed and what hadn't. His body still ached in the same places, leg wrapped in rough splints, ribs bandaged with sap-slicked leaves. But something in the air told him a new day had started. Barely. Another day, and somehow, he was still alive. He tilted his head with effort. Next to him, where the moss dipped gently toward the creek bed, lay a small bundle. Red berries, plump and wild. 2 thick leaves folded over what looked like mushrooms, clean, white, whole. They had been left with care. Not dropped, not scavenged, arranged. He blinked again. The image felt too tender for the wilderness. No teeth marks, no claw trails. Just intention. He reached slowly, hand trembling, and brought a berry to his lips. It burst between his teeth, sweet and tart with a hint of something earthy. Not poisoned, not rotten, just food. His stomach, which had felt numb the day before, suddenly roared awake. He ate with caution, not out of fear, but respect. There was something sacred about this offering. He didn't speak, didn't whisper thanks out loud, but in his mind, he offered it all the same. As the light grew, he saw more. Scuff marks in the dirt where something heavy had knelt, a long smear in the moss like a palm dragging past, and faint, almost delicate footprints, not from boots, not hooved, wide, deep, spread toes, the kind of impression no animal should be able to make unless it walked like a man and weighed more than 2. He didn't count the hours that passed. He drifted in and out of sleep, but every time he stirred, there was something new. A small pile of twigs shaped into a crossbar to hold up his water flask. A bit of bark peeled back from a tree revealing sap like medicine. And once, just before dusk, a low thud behind him. He opened his eyes just in time to see it vanish. A blur of reddish-brown slipping behind a stand of spruce, silent as breath. He didn't try to call out, not because he feared it would leave, but because he didn't want to break whatever fragile thread had formed between them. Instead, he listened, watched, felt. That night, the moon cut clean through the fog and painted the clearing in silver. Jonas lay still, head tilted just enough to catch movement in the periphery. The wind had settled into a hush. The temperature dropped hard. Frost glittered faintly across the ferns. Then, footsteps, not rushed, not meandering, just a slow orbit around him, always a little out of reach. Sometimes they paused. He could feel the presence behind the sound, the weight of it, the warmth. His heart didn't race. He didn't flinch. Something had changed in him. At some point, he slept, deep, dreamless. When he woke again, the sun had risen higher, and his body felt different. Still injured, but steadier. The fever was gone. The ache in his ribs no longer screamed with every breath. He pushed himself upright with one arm. The movement came easier than expected. He glanced down and saw new leaves pressed against his side, tied clean with fresh vines. The color of the sap had changed, darker, thicker. It had dried against his skin, but not crusted, more like a balm. He reached down and touched his ankle. The splint held firm. Better than any field medic would have done out here. And still, no voice, no language, just presence. He looked up and scanned the trees. Still no sign, but he knew he was being watched. There was something oddly comforting in that. Not like being hunted, more like being guarded. The day moved on. The sun filtered through the canopy in warm shafts. Birds returned to the air. A squirrel passed by, nose twitching, then vanished again. And always that quiet. Not empty, full, breathing. By afternoon, Jonas could sit fully upright. His back rested against the base of a cedar, and he looked out over the small clearing like it had become a room he knew. He ate the last of the berries, drank from the carved wooden flask, which had been refilled somehow. The water tasted like snowmelt. At one point, he thought he heard a faint rustle behind him, different from the footsteps. Slower, softer. He turned his head and saw movement. One arm, just one, retreating into the undergrowth. But the hand lingered longer than it needed to. It was wide, thick, but the fingers curved like a human's would when saying goodbye. That night, the moon rose again, larger than the night before, a pale disk hanging low over the ridge. Jonas couldn't sleep. He stared at the stars between branches, his breath fogging gently into the air. The wound on his side pulsed less. His chest moved easier, and the cold didn't bite his heart. He whispered, barely, a word he hadn't said in years. "Thank you." He didn't expect an answer, but he heard a sound. Low, close, like a breath drawn in reply. His eyes welled. Not from pain, from something else. He couldn't name it. Not yet. But it lived in the space between that sound and the silence that followed. The morning broke with a silence that felt too sharp to be natural. Jonas stirred before the light fully reached him, as if his body knew something the sky hadn't said yet. His breath hovered in the air, pale and fleeting. The sap paste on his ribs had turned brittle. His leg throbbed less. He sat up slower this time, not because it hurt less, but because something about the quiet felt off. The air tasted different. Not the usual earthy rot of forest decay, not even the clean bite of frost. It was thinner, hollow. The forest had stopped breathing. He leaned his back against the tree and listened. There was nothing. No squirrels darting through leaves, no wind threading through the ferns. Even the birds had gone mute. Then came the sound. It didn't belong. A voice. Not a roar, not a growl, not the low thrum of the creature that had been circling him for nights now. This was human. Far off, echoing, distorted by distance and fog, but unmistakably real. "Left the ridge! Check by the creek!" He froze. The voice came again, closer this time. Another man. "Watch your footing, Ray!" Boots against stone, branches cracking, voices in the living forest. Jonas pushed himself higher, enough to peer through the trees. He could barely see the slope above the clearing, but the movement was clear. Flashes of orange, the dull glint of metal, and that unmistakable rhythm of people moving together who've done it before. A search team, or hikers. But something in their cadence said more than casual wandering. He should have called out. He could have, but his mouth stayed shut. Because just then, he heard it. Not from the man, from somewhere deeper in the woods, far behind him. A sound he now knew well. Low, drawn out, carried on the air like it had been carved into the cold. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, and the men must have heard it too, because their footsteps faltered. The voices paused. Then one shouted, uncertain now. "Did you hear that?" Then a muffled reply. Something about turning back, and then nothing. Silence rushed back in like a tide. The forest held its breath again. Jonas stayed still. His heart didn't race, his hands didn't shake. He just stared at the ridge and waited. And after a long while, the woods exhaled again. The pressure lifted. The presence receded. It was still out there, still watching. But not from fear, from intent. Not long after, he heard the footfall again, not from above, but behind. Heavy, deliberate. It didn't circle this time. It approached, closer, until he could feel it. He turned slowly, and there it was, the creature, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. Its shoulders hunched slightly, its eyes softer than he remembered. Its chest rose and fell with the kind of rhythm that only came from standing near something fragile. And in one massive hand it held something. Jonas recognized it instantly. His notebook. The old leather-bound one that must have fallen during the fall. Mud-stained, water-warped, but still intact. The creature stepped forward, not too close, then crouched and gently placed the book on the moss in front of him. Not tossed, not dropped, set. And then it sat, not more than a few feet away, not looming, not guarding, just there. Jonas stared at the notebook, then at the eyes staring back at him. And in that moment, something passed between them. Not words, not gestures, just knowing. He didn't move, didn't need to. He opened the notebook slowly, fingers running over the cover. Pages stuck together from water, ink blurred. But the last line was still legible. Not everything in the forest is cruel, but man can be. He looked up. The creature was still watching. Its expression unreadable, but its stillness said more than 1,000 words. Jonas felt his throat tighten. He wanted to say something, to ask something, but nothing in English felt right. So instead, he looked into those dark eyes and nodded. And the creature, so massive, so foreign, so silent, nodded back, not as mimicry, as understanding. Then it rose, its movement slow, measured. It stepped back into the trees, the light catching on its fur, leaving behind only the scent of pine, earth, and something else. A sound followed. One last time. That same call. long, low, like the forest itself was exhaling for the first time in years. And Jonas knew he would carry that sound with him long after the bruises faded. The wind carried voices, at first faint, like a memory whispered into the trees, then louder, with a crisp echo of urgency. Jonas opened his eyes to that sound. It wasn't the heavy step of the creature he'd come to accept, nor the soft movement of leaves brushed by wind. These were human again. Boots, shouts, the kind of sound that didn't belong in this part of the forest unless something had gone wrong. He blinked against the early afternoon light filtering down in fractured beams. His breath left him slow. There was no panic, no dread, only a growing awareness that his time here, whatever this had been, was nearing its end. The ground beneath him felt softer now, like the forest itself had cradled him these last days. His body still ached, but not in the sharp way it had before. His leg throbbed with dull protest. The bruises at his ribs tightened when he inhaled too deep. But he could sit. He could listen. And he did. The men were moving closer, their voices bouncing off the ridge. Someone called a name, maybe his. He couldn't be sure. Then, silence again. Not the sacred stillness of the creature's presence, but the startled pause of people hearing something they couldn't explain. Moments passed. Then, through the trees, just beyond a knot of birch, came a flicker of orange. Jackets, most likely, and the glint of a sun off metal. Radios, equipment. One man stepped into view first, cautious, eyes sweeping the brush. Another behind him, younger, holding what looked like a first aid kit. They hadn't seen him yet. Jonas stayed still. Something told him he wouldn't be alone for long, and he wasn't. From behind him, at the edge of the hollow where he'd been lying, came that familiar presence. A shadow stretching across moss, a breath that wasn't his own. He didn't need to turn. He knew. And this time, it didn't retreat into the trees. It moved closer. Not in fear, not in secrecy, but as if it too knew what this moment meant. The air shifted between them. Jonas turned his head, slow and deliberate. The creature stood tall in the light, half-shadowed, half-revealed, as if the forest couldn't decide whether to show it or keep it hidden forever. Its fur caught the light in waves of red and brown. Its eyes found his, steady and unblinking. And for the first time, Jonas saw something different. Sadness. Not human, not exactly, but real, deep, unmistakable. It stepped forward once more and crouched down. Still massive, still powerful, but smaller now somehow, like a mountain kneeling to speak to the wounded. In its hand, the notebook again. Jonas watched as it extended its arm, laying the book gently on his lap. Then it sat back, legs folded beneath it like a guardian waiting for permission. He looked at the book, then back at it. Their eyes met, and that silence between them thickened into something sacred. A sound broke the moment. One of the men shouting, closer now. "I think I see something." The creature didn't flinch, didn't run. Instead, it tilted its head, watching Jonas, as if asking a question without words. Jonas placed his hand gently on the notebook. His fingers tightened around it. He nodded. Once, and the creature rose, stepped back, paused, then made a sound, deep in its chest, like a farewell sung through stone. It turned, slipped into the trees, quieter than any man that size should have been. The last thing Jonas saw was the flick of one long arm brushing aside a branch. Then nothing. By the time the first rescuer reached the hollow, Jonas was alone. The man dropped to his knees beside him. "Jesus Christ! He's alive! We found him!" The others came quickly, hands checking pulse, voices climbing over each other. Jonas didn't speak. He just handed the notebook to the one who looked oldest and said, "I'm fine." The man furrowed his brow. "You've been out here for almost a week. You've got a busted leg, cracked ribs, dehydration. You sure about fine?" Jonas didn't answer. He was still listening, still waiting for that sound again. But the forest had gone quiet. At the hospital, the light was too bright, the walls too white. Everything smelled like chemicals and cold air recycled too many times. A nurse hovered near him, checking IV lines. A doctor asked questions he didn't answer. They ran scans, took blood, whispered outside his room. When they changed the bandages, the doctor paused. "This isn't right," he muttered. Jonas looked up. "The wound, it's sealed cleaner than it should be. No infection. Almost, I don't know, like something pulled the fever out of you." Jonas just stared. "You on antibiotics before this? Any meds? Plants, maybe?" Jonas shook his head. "Not anything you'd have in your cabinet." The doctor said nothing else, just changed the dressing and left the room. Late that night, the halls fell quiet. The machines hummed. Outside the window, a soft mist crawled across the parking lot, curling around the lamps like smoke. Jonas sat with a notebook in his lap, pages warped and smudged. His handwriting was barely legible in some places, but in the corner of one page, one he didn't remember writing, was a mark. Not a letter, not a word, just a shape. Circular, balanced, familiar. Like something he'd seen carved into a tree trunk just before waking that first morning. He didn't sleep that night. He sat still, listening to the quiet, remembering the weight of those eyes, the way the forest had watched him not as prey, but as someone who'd been let in. And far off, in the corner of his mind, the call echoed once more. But it wasn't a sound of goodbye. Not this time. It was a memory returning home. It had been years since the forest swallowed him whole. And yet, in the middle of this quiet little cafe tucked into the outskirts of Missoula, with the windows fogged from steady autumn drizzle and the smell of burned espresso clinging to the walls, it still lived in him. Jonas sat at the far table by the window, where the light fell soft and amber over his hands. Time had not been kind to his bones, but it had done its work. His hair had silvered completely, his skin lined with the kind of wear that only comes from surviving something too large to name. He wore the same coat he'd walked out of that forest in. It didn't fit like it used to. Nothing did. Outside, the rain traced slow rivers down the glass, and the Bitterroot Mountains hung ghost-like in the distance, gray-blue and half-dissolved by fog. He stirred his coffee with the back of his spoon, eyes fixed on something far beyond the glass, something that couldn't be seen. The bell above the door jingled softly. The chair across from him scraped as someone pulled it back. "Mind if I join you?" Jonas didn't look up right away. He already knew who it was. Young voice. Nervous but respectful. The kind of voice that had read too many things but lived too few of them. He gave a small nod. The man sat, leather jacket too new, tape recorder tucked into his coat pocket, though he hadn't pulled it out yet. A notepad in his hand, open to a blank page. "I heard you used to live near Hamilton, out by Roaring Fork Trail." Jonas didn't answer. "I also heard you disappeared out there for almost a week. Broke your leg. No one thought you'd make it." Still, Jonas said nothing. "But then they found you. Clean bandages, no frostbite, no infection, just you. Sitting up like you'd been resting in your own bed, like nothing had happened at all." Jonas glanced at the notepad. The young man waited. The silence between them stretched until it nearly broke. Then Jonas spoke, voice low, worn. "If you're looking for a monster story, I ain't got one." "I'm not," the reporter said quickly. "I'm looking for the truth. There's plenty of truth in silence. You ought to try it sometime." The reporter hesitated, then closed his notebook. He didn't leave, just waited. Jonas looked out the window again. Rain falling harder now, making the light outside smear like watercolors on glass. "It's funny," he said. "Most people think the scariest thing in the woods is what they don't understand. Something big, hairy, dangerous. But that's not it." The reporter leaned in, but Jonas didn't speak right away. His fingers brushed the rim of his mug. "No," he said finally. "The most terrifying thing in those trees is the idea that maybe you were never really alone. That something watched you for days, weeks, knew you, understood you better than any man ever did, and still chose not to hurt you." The man across from him furrowed his brow. "That's not fear," Jonas continued. "That's hope. And hope, when you've spent your life trying to bury it, when it creeps back in through the cracks you thought were sealed shut, that's the scariest damn thing of all." The cafe stayed quiet around them. A waitress passed behind with a clatter of dishes, the smell of bacon and old coffee hanging in the air. Outside, headlights moved like ghosts through the mist. Jonas leaned back. "I don't want my name printed," he said. "Of course not," the reporter replied. "I understand." "I doubt you do." They sat a while longer. The rain didn't stop. Neither did the weight in Jonas's chest. When the man finally stood to leave, he didn't press for more. He didn't beg for the full story. He just nodded, like maybe he'd felt it too. That thing in the quiet that doesn't need a name. Jonas stayed after he left. Hours, maybe. The waitress refilled his coffee without asking. The mountains beyond the window stayed wrapped in fog, as if the forest still held its secrets too tightly to let go. And then he saw it, far off, beyond the tree line. A movement not shaped like a deer, not human. Red-brown, large, moving with intent, but not with rush. For a split second, it passed between two trees, and the mist parted just enough to give shape to what the world still didn't believe. Jonas didn't smile. He didn't wave, but he lifted his hand just slightly off the table. A gesture so small it might have been mistaken for nothing. And then he whispered something only he could hear. Something like a name that never needed to be spoken. The rain tapped against the glass. The forest didn't answer, but it was listening. Always had been. Always would. Sometimes the quiet places speak the loudest. Not in words, but in the way they hold us when the world forgets we exist. Deep in the wilderness, far from roads and noise and names, there are truths that no book ever taught, no preacher ever said out loud. Out there, where the fog moves like memory and the trees remember things older than language, we're reminded of something many of us have tried hard to forget. We were never meant to walk this world alone. The story you've just heard isn't about fear. Not really. It's not about what hides in the dark or moves through the trees when no one's watching. It's about the spaces between people, the grief we carry, the guilt we bury, and the quiet grace that sometimes finds us when we've stopped looking for it. It's about the kind of connection that doesn't need to be spoken to be real. A glance, a silence, a gesture that says, "I see you, and I won't turn away." Because maybe the things we've been told to fear aren't monsters at all. Maybe they're mirrors. Maybe the unknown isn't waiting to harm us, but to hold up a truth we're not ready to face. That empathy is still possible, even in the wildest places. That kindness can take many forms. That something, someone, might choose compassion over instinct. And if they can, then so can we. This isn't a tale that needs proof or photographs. It doesn't belong in textbooks or headlines. It belongs in the part of us that still believes in wonder, in second chances, in the possibility that what we've lost can be found again. Not exactly as it was, but changed, softened, made whole in ways we never expected. So if you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever been on the edge of giving up, let this story be a quiet reminder. There is still something good watching over you. And sometimes, when you least expect it, the forest answers back. Thank you for walking with us to the edge of the trees. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe so you won't miss the next journey into the shadows and the light that waits beyond them. Until next time, keep listening for the silence. It just might be listening back.